bagoy kanangkan.
Don, salamat sa kanyang tawa sa triburoy.
Dakon salamat takod bagoy taduhang nagkabatan para kanami.
Dakon salamat ikaw, Professor JONDY Arpilleda.
Nim kimanan ni Stephen Kuibani Hagfan makanulong dani Lania adini Stephen bebunut Bali Bali guna sa satu Bali guna sa gamung Ya katum lamut pat Bali tu balu Demum skuli kum ngalibun Sbalakadi kum ngalibun Lamas filin isak makam tebalin Ni sedang menmabeni nais kel Magaudini dan tau Bendeng lami bebenul balui baling Saging tundan Sensepet tebutang fedian Sakalaton ulam matam Dang kam gunung sengan Dang kam gunung hafan Saging tundan
admiration and respect for our earth and how we look after it and how we are connected as people to it. This one evening we were invited to a Tiboli house and we were treated to a native meal and of their local delicacies. They even performed for us using their native instruments. It's the first time that I ever experienced anything like that. It was amazing to see them all together.
Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. Thank you so much for welcoming us into your home and also to experience your beautiful culture. Introduced me to the beautiful textiles of your culture and I just fell in love. Kasi ang ganda po. Ang ganda, and I feel like the international stage should be able to see it and know that here in the Philippines, this is one of our pride and joys. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be with you all and to learn about the origin of it, because I wanted to understand first where it came from before bringing it to the universe stage. So thank you so much, po. I will definitely take pride in showcasing your culture to the international stage.
I think people need to know about what it means to them, how they put together their crafts, how it's been carried down through generation to generation. And I think even when I experienced that, that's what made me fall in love with what they do, their craftsmanship, their art, their handiwork, their products that they make. I fell in love with it because of the history of it and what it means to them and the reverence and respect that they have for their craft. So I think, if people were to realize that, it would really add value to that product and people would be proud to own a product from Mindanao.
Sa kwento ng buhay may lahi na ligaw, lupang kapatagan ay iniwan, napadpad patungo sa tuktok ng kabukiran. Pagkain at bahay, maging ang kasuotan, kapwang hinahanap, parehong di sapat. Ang tanging kabuhayan, kainin at mga sulaman. O ganito ang buhay ng tribong Blaan. Ilang taon nagtitiis, nagdaramdam, munting tahanan nila rin. Sa kabila ng labis na pagtitiis, ang bawat pamilya labis ang tuwa, sama-samang mabuhay ng tahimik at mayabang. Iyak bitil na lang lahat nan lafan timol tanak ditungan, sige pilihan no lagar kami gunan. Tiyak pitil na lanlaan di munan, lapan timul tanah didungan, sige milihan no lagar kami gunan. O ganito ang buhay ng tribong Blaan. hand in hand, hand in hand,
Good evening, I'm Dr. JONDY Arpilleda, and I'm going to discuss to you how to make horror short stories. Okay, now this portion of or segment of the lecture is rated SPG, strong parental guidance, because this contains themes, languages, violence, sex, horror, or drugs that is not suitable for young audiences. Specifically, some portions in here, I showcased some pictures that are gory and terrifying. So for those faint-hearted individuals, I want you to bear yourself with whatever you see. Okay, we'll start. Now, Edgar Allan Poe said that the scariest monsters are the ones that lurk within our souls. By the way, Edgar Allan Poe is the master of macabre stories. Personally, I idolize his writing of horror short stories. Now, horror by definition is a genre of fiction which is intended to or has the capacity to frighten, scare, disgust, or startle its readers or viewers by inducing feelings of horror or terror. Literary historian John Anthony Codden has defined horror short story as a piece of fiction in prose of variable length, which shocks or even frightens the reader, or perhaps induces a feeling of repulsion or loathing. Now, horror is frequently supernatural, or there's an element of supernatural. Like in our case, we have the supernatural elements like tikbalang, nuno sa punso, aswang, ungo in Bisaya, kapre, mermaid in that instance, and a lot more. Though it can be non-supernatural, yet often the central menace or work of horror fiction can be interpreted as a metaphor for a larger fears of a society, meaning some writers are using metaphor or metapora to represent a certain individual, for example. Though the writer intentionally used the aswang, yet what he really depicts is about how that particular person or a criminal wreaks havoc in the society. Now, you might as well be saying, what are those things that a writer has to consider, or what are really the techniques that should you follow in making short stories? So I'll give you tips. The first one is you have to choose a good theme. By definition, the theme in a story is its underlying message or big idea in your short story. This might be a belief or idea that transcends cultural barriers. It is usually universal in nature. So there's a lot of theme that you can choose upon. Actually, there is this famous phrase that everything has been written already under the sun, but as a horror writer, you have to be imaginative to choose an old theme, yet in a new setting, in a new angle, so that you will have a very good presentation. Yet, plot has something to do with it. Now, as what I've said here, when we talk about the theme, it is the message that you want to drive at in your short story. Number two, you have to find a good angle. Now, craft an intriguing introduction. What I mean by a good angle. Now, even though the theme about Aswang or the story about Aswang is already familiar to us, yet the way you are going to write it, or you are going to begin it, or you make your introduction, should make a difference in how you have plotted everything or narrated everything. It's very important for you to do away with the usual or traditional way of writing a good short story, or a certain story. Now, what I mean by good angle, maybe you can begin with something, a very intriguing uh, situation, or a very intriguing or thought-provoking introduction, or perhaps a backstory, or anything that you can find that would entice the readers to go on reading your narrative. Number three, I'm going to give you an example here. Uh, I, I, I called this particular introduction from my story, Ang Tunglo. So let me read it to you. Maugyo'y pagguwa ni aking sa kaliguan, kalit lang, likipat-kipat ang suga sa sulod sa iyang selda, ug iya kining gilantaw kadyot, ug sa kabalakang gabasig mo diretso nig kapalong, iya dayon giduot ang switch nga nahimutang sa kilid sa kasilyas. Nakaginhawa siya lalom sa dihang mibalik ra kini sa iyang kasiga. As you can see, I began here my introduction, or I choose an angle wherein I showcased here, or I presented here, a scene wherein the main character, a king, is inside the cell, and this sudden flickering of the lamp, and when he was then going to the casillas or bathroom. So I choose this one because it will be a prelude. Somehow it will give an opening scenario of my story, and I'm giving some hints on how it would be, it would be the case all throughout the short stories. Another one is, this one is taken from my story, Ang Ungo sa Barangay Matikdum. I began my story with this. Ang panuktok sa pultahan ug balik-balik nga sampit sa ngalan ni Kapitan Anye ang mipusgay sa way timik niyang katulog. Bisag bugat ang iyang mga mata ug labad ang ulo, napugos si Kapitan Anye pagbakod sa higdaanan aron susihon kung kinsay nagsampit niya. Migimaw sa katre ang iyang asawang si Risa. So in here, even though I began with the scene wherein Kapitan Anye is sleeping, at least, I'm giving somehow an urgency in the situation. And I chose this one because This will also direct the attention of the readers, or give an atmosphere of somehow ghostly atmosphere to the readers, that something uh, something different is happening, especially so that there was this knocking on the door in the middle of the night. Okay. Number three, be creative, innovative in crafting your story plot. Now, in this case, as you can see, I, I had here the plot structure of Freytag's pyramid, wherein it features five. Supposedly, this one is for novel. Yet, I think a short story could also have this. The first one is exposition, wherein we meet the characters, the primary situation. Then after that, the narrative and the dramatic tension builds up, and this is the rising action. Then the story will go into the climax, or the tension peaks. Then there's a falling action wherein the narrative and dramatic tension uh, become ease, and the resolution wherein the story comes to a close. Now, this is just a typical way of how a plot structure is being made. Yet, you know what, as what I've said a while ago, you have to be creative. Not that you are going to follow this format. You can begin actually with somehow a surge of, of action. It could be like a climactic way of how you are going to begin your introduction, like that of somebody is running, okay, because somebody is chasing after him, so things like that. So it depends on you. You should not you should do away with those introductions that are already common, that is predictable. You have to come up with an introduction or an angle that that will summon the readers, that will you know that will stimulate the imagination, and that's something that will catch their attention, because the introduction actually is the doorway to your short story. Now, number four, you have to put foreshadowing and suspense in your story. Now, when we talk about foreshadowing, it is a literary device in which writers gives an advance or what is to come later in the story. Now, foreshadowing might be in a form of an object, for example. So, if the story is horror like this, so obviously you can utilize some foreshadowing like that of uh, a strong breeze, or a particular, or the shirking of the rats, perhaps the sounds of the rats. So something that or the howling of the wolf, or a particular uh, uh, or a certain dog. Instance like that will somehow give an atmosphere of what a horror fiction is all about. Then foreshadowing often appears at the beginning of a story or a chapter, and it helps the reader develop expectations about the upcoming events. So the reason why, some writers would say, uh, if you have utilized a a you know a an armas as a foreshadow, so you really have to let uh, that armas explode. Kay kung ang foreshadow bali nimo, kung di nimo magamit, kung wala iya pulos, wala gihapong iya nato, wala iya meaning sa imo short story. So everything should really be, or should have an organic uh, let us say significance in your story. Otherwise, ang foreshadowing nimo, uh, wala lang. I particular I if I can recall, there is this story wherein the foreshadow is that uh, kanang hangin na midampi sa kuan skin sa iya amigo, and it gives us the hint na ang iya amigo di ay is ano uh, ang iya best friend is namatay. So things like that. The number 5, try twist endings but cautiously do it. Even though a twist ending is supposed to give a reader a jolt, a hindsight, it should seem perfectly reasonable. The best ones seem inevitable and seamless. Now, talking about the ending, a writer should orchestrate his ending or her ending in such a way that it still leaves someone or the reader hanging. Something that will, you know, somehow will leave them pondering of what is what will happen next. So if you happen to watch movies nowadays, especially for horror films, you can see or you can observe that the directors are actually using usually twist endings or open-ended endings, meaning they let the readers or I mean the the viewers decide for themselves of what will happen next to the main character or the antagonist or the supernatural element. Because you know what, guys, if you will just end things the way they are, well, there's no significance in it. So I think for me, and I believe in this, na if you just give everything, uh, it is as if you are actually insulting the intellect of the viewers. And you know what? It's a famous also in poetry na you show and not tell. Number 6, you heighten the rising action. Now, it's actually very difficult for you to do this, especially if you are not, fond of watching horror films. And, you know, the proper way of using it, how to use that one, what are those words that you are going to use, how are you going to control the pacing of your sentences, and so with the idea and the imagery, it goes with it. So as a writer, you really have to make sure na ang pacing nimo, and my advice to you, kung gusto nimo na heighten bali ang imo presentation ng katong event na mo heighten ang action, you have to shorten your sentences, and you have to describe the situation further na murag nag-apas pod ang imo pag sulat. You have to read and read your work na sa tingin nimo na nag-move pod siya, kay nagpataas pod ang iya intensity. Now, I have here an example. Wadam ha, kalit nga misulirat ang mga mata ni Nung Puroy og miyam-yam kini. Nabantayan kini ni Okloy maong iyang gikablit ang iyang katapad. Kap, tanawa si Nung Puroy kap, misulirat ang mga mata. Nakalingi silang tanan sa tiguwang. Kalit ni huros ang kusog nga hangin. Halos napalong ang dala nilang mga suga ug moron. Nagbanha ang mga kukok, kabog ug uban pang mga langgam sa kalasangan. Nakaatras silang riza, waning, trining uban pang mga kababayan-an. Naggunitay nga hadlok. Ang mga bata may action nagpanghilak. As you can see, I actually shorten my sentences instead of having a lengthy one. Mas mga gagmubo na lang siya kay para paspas po ang pagbasa sa mga readers. Okay, number 7 is shape good characters. You know what? You really have to, let us say, describe your characters. You have to develop them. You have to, what I do with my works is that when I, include a certain character in my short story, I study them. I look into the people that I met. I remember the people that I met, and I draw the description, and so the way their actuations and the way they talk, the way they, the way they behave in my story are observed. I see to it na they are realistic when they will be, presented in my short story. Even how, you know, how minute the role of a particular character is, I really make sure na nindot ang ako pagka-present di ana sa ilaha, and they evolve, meaning they are not just simply there, but they have played some roles in the story. So how are you going to build good characters? So obviously come up with, relatable, and by doing so, relatable characters, you have to describe them, use words to describe them. The number, oh, give every character a reason to be in the story. That's a very famous advice among writers. Na, you know what? Don't just place a particular character or name in there so as mudaghan ang mga characters sa imo. If each one of those characters should have a role, and they have to talk perhaps or act perhaps, and they are identifiable. Okay, I have here excerpt from my story. Uh, Kalit ni Siga ang mga mata ni aking pakita sa nausab nga dagway ni Adela. Ipangtubuan ang tibuok lawas ni ini og itom nga mabalahibo sa makadagko sa butakal. Nagdungan og tag-as ang iyang mga ngipon ug kuko. Sige nig limba-limba nag-agulo sa kasakit. Nakapanguro si aking sa iyang nasaksihan apan iyang gipagtigbabaw ang iyang kaisog. Abtik nga gikuha ni aking ang pisi nga kanhing binuhing binuhi sa baboy sa ubos sa abuhan. Pagsulod niya sa balik sa kwarto, iya dayong gikubkuban ang dalaga unya gigapos ang mga kamot ni ini. Apan kusganon si Adela, dali ra niya ning nabuskag. Mas misamot noon ang kabangis ni ini. Nagapangub. Siga kaayo ang mga mata ni ini nga mituto kaniya. Og sa usa ka pamilok nahimo si Adela og dakong iro. Nalingkaag ang mabalahibo ingon humahambat kang aking. Now in here, I actually describe how Adela transformed into an ungo. So as you can see, I actually used some effective words to describe how she transforms. Mao na kalisod. When I made this one, naglisod ko buhat ni ini kay I have really to use those effective terms and those appropriate mga terminologies sa Cebuano, kay I'm not so familiar with them also, so I need to research ng miana and even how to describe them. So that's how difficult it is. Now, what I mean here, going back to characterization, or I mean how to describe good characters. Actually, in the story of this, I introduced uh, a king in the story prior to this instance, and Adila too. Okay, so characterization is the way in which the author profiles and shows the personality of the character. So if your character is a chubby woman in her 40s, so you have to describe her. And if your character is a child, a 9-year-old child, so you go into the psychological makeup of a child, go to his or her personality, and we observe. Kung dili ka familiar, say mag-obserba ka sa, obserbaran nimo ang makinaiya, ang sinultian ng usa ka bata, para when you are going to, come up with a character the same as that of a 9-year-old na imo na obserbaran, it is effective. Kay, you know what, some authors are so keen when it comes to, the characters that you are using. Okay, even me, I observe some writers are actually coming up with characters na I was then thinking na kuan katong kining si kuan Joanna is 40 years old but the way she talks murag dili man. So things like that. There is this disconnection of the personality of the person of the character sa iyaha. Okay, so you have to be very careful in your characterization. Then for the tips for characterization, you have direct narration, meaning you are just immediately you know you 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 narrated along the in the narration in your story ang character ni Ana gi-describe lang nimo siya. Then you have action, the way you have characterized or described the character through the action, the way she moves, the way she acts, okay, in the story. Kung unsay iya kuan, if she is an nabataw na to dili siya kung edukado na babae, then the way she talks, the way she behaves in situations kana pod kinahanglan mugawas pod nga dili pod siya edukada. Then conversation, in the conversation alone one can also sense whether this is a lady that is 18 years old or kini siya tiguwang na nataw. So you can characterize or build the character through conversations. Then thought, the way the character is thinking, the way he or she uh, thinks of other person, or ang iya realization perhaps kung nag self-talk siya, would reflect also of the character that she is. So kinahanglan careful pud kani ana the way siya kibali maghuna-huna, kung labi na kung first person point of view ang imuha kanang gigamit niya kuan pag describe the situation. Okay. Now, number 8, you design believable settings. What I mean by settings is that you have to describe the world, okay, that that the characters are moving, are the 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 setting, or meaning the world that you are creating in your short story. The sights, the sound, the colors and textures are all vividly painted and portrayed. So for a painter, bali, you have really to have kanang maayo ang pagpaint nimo sa canvas to paint the images. For writers, kinahanglan gamiton nimo ang mga words. So a writer imagines a short story to be happening in a place that is rooted in his or her mind, the location of the story's actions, along with the time in which it occurs. So is the setting. So meaning, kung 1940s ang imo setting, so kinahanglan the way you describe the place, kung uso ni adto ang mga baile, then kung ang imo kibali setting na sa bailihan, then you describe it properly. Ang mga kuan music, so something that the the readers can describe, or something can think of, like ang ilang mga sinina, ang ilang madungog, ang ilang masimhot, ang ilang matilawan. So things like that. Or like those. Okay, number 9, you establish a conflict. A short story should have a conflict. Otherwise, di siya matawag na short story. Now, a conflict a conflict could either be person to person, but in short stories, kung horror ang imuha, pwede man tao sa tao, no? Then pwede po person and a supernatural being. Then pwede po man versus nature, and a lot more. So but you have to establish a conflict. Okay, kung walay conflict gani, well, there's nothing to resolve in your short story. Okay, number 10, be consistent with your point of view. This is actually the most common errors among writers na usahay mawani sila. Point of view refers to who is telling or narrating a short story. A story can be told in 4 different ways. The first one, first person, meaning you are actually telling a story in your own perspective sa imong panglantaw. Like miadto ko sa balay ug akong nakita ang akong asawa nga natulog na sa higdaanan tapat tupad sa akong anak. So you are telling it ako. It could be second person. So this one second person is the most not commonly used. Kaya even may maglisod ko siya, permis siya ang akong muna siya ang pinangga ni Pedro, or things like that. But it's very difficult. Okay. Then the third person, that is actually the most common, ang third person, kining miadto si Aking sa iyang puloy-anan o nagkuha sa iyang mga gamit aron mo diretso na dayon siya paingon sa iyang trabahoan. Samtang padulong na siya sa dalan, iyang nakatagbo si Jose nga nagdala kini og bag. Nangutana dayon si Aking nga naman. So you are actually describing the two persons, a third person. You are detached to them, but you are there observing them and siya, si Aking, things like that. Then the third, the omniscient, you're all knowing. There's a kanang you can go into the mind of every character. Mag-unsa-unsa na lang. Third person omniscient, pwede po na combination na siya, silang dalaw duha mi adto tapos og nahunaan na niya, nahunaan niya. So it's like you are God. You can go into their sight. So you can also make use of that. Then number 11, you use short sentences and active voice. So I think it's clear. I made mention this one. Na for short stories, you really have to do away with lengthy. Siguro for descriptions, but then kung muhay na ganing event, you really have to make sure na short sentences and you have to have an active voice para ang pacing kusog. Paspas ang pacing sa imong short stories. But it depends on you guys. Pero that's actually my advice. Now, the number 12 tip is a writer who can describe or can write as like speaking. So it's like it's short story. It's like you have to write your story in such a way na makarelate ang uban and you're actually speaking to them, things like that para they will be enticed to read the whole piece of yours. Now a writer who can describe the in a speaking tone is considered as the most amazing storyteller. You need to become the friend of the writer. They will like you when you can do it. So that's actually one of the advices of Stephen King. You know him. So kinahanglan, you have to have a speaking tone. Okay, if you are using mga highfalutin words, difficult words, na unsaon man, they cannot appreciate your work. So if you're writing Cebuano or Bisaya, you have to make sure na use those terms that are common, that are understandable in this generation. You might include a little, sparingly, some Cebuano na mga kuanlaom na mga words, pero ginagmay lang, something that makasabot pod sila through the sentence alone, construction alone, and sa context na imo gisulti. So that's actually my technique. I don't usually bombard my readers with deep words, kanang mga words na mga nagamit sa una kay Na, di naganahan ang mga readers ni mo ni Ana. Then number 13, revise your work until it becomes frightening to you. Okay, so you know what? You have, as a writer, that's actually the most challenging part and difficult part. You have to be a critic of your own work. Um, Even me, kanang musulat gani ko, there's series of revision that I'm doing. It's not that it's just, you know, I am writing in one setting and voila, it's finished. No, I have to revise it, to look it again, and especially kung dito gani sa mga kuan kanang mga thrilling ng mga part, I go back, yung mga kadlok ng mga part, I go back and read again and read na until ako mismo mahadlok sa ako gibasa. So if dili pa na ako ma-convince, if I cannot convince myself that what I'm working on isn't frightening, I will not stop. I have to make sure na kadlukan gud siya. Kadlukan man yun, and it's really difficult. Pero you can, you can master that along the way. And one technique or one tip that I can give you, watch always kanang mga horror films. And murag makakuha kag mga techniques on how unsaon na siya pagbuhat. Okay, so that winds up my lecture on how to write horror fiction. So I hope that you learn something from this, to this lecture of mine, and have a very fruitful evening or morning to everyone. And I would like to also acknowledge the copyright owners of the pictures that I use, and and all those stuff. I'm not actually owning it. So thank you and God bless.
sa ari ako unungan mo.
Tuhui, laumi, matuod kayo ang paghigugma ko.
Kanos matapos ang gugma sa dughan mo.
Pinangga, huwag pagkupas, samtang ako may kinabuhi pa. Tumanong ka ngayon ang atong mga kasakit o kalipay, gayong antang duha. Tumanong ka gayon ang